welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining DataBank today. My name is Christian and I'm the Events and Sponsorship Manager for DataBank, and we're so excited to welcome you. Today, our Chief Information Security Officer, Mark Houpt, will be speaking to you about identity access management technologies and how to initiate, record, and manage user identities and access permissions. At the end of the webinar, we will be opening up a live Q&A session with Mark, so feel free to submit any questions you have into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Thank you again for joining us. I'll turn it over to Mark to introduce himself, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Christian. It is my pleasure to be with you today. As Christian said, I am Mark Houpt, the Chief Information Security Officer at DataBank. I've been with DataBank for almost 7 years now, and have some extensive information security experience. As I said in a panel discussion earlier this week, I was doing information security before information security was cool. I started information security way back in the early 1990s with the U.S. federal government, and worked my way around to various organizations in the financial, healthcare, academic, and other sectors as well. So I bring a lot of experience that hopefully my sharing of experience with you is what will be the value that you have today. So as we get started on this identity management discussion, I want you to think back to a movie, one of my favorite movies from the 1990s. Actually, the 1980s, to be honest with you, but the movie Hoosiers, okay? And this movie is about a small town basketball team in Indiana, where the new coach, Gene Hackman, comes in and he is replacing a long-time coach, and he has to get the players, not only the players, but also the community and others to rethink how they're doing basketball and really kind of come together as a cohesive team. The way that he does this is he breaks the team down and goes back to the very basics of basketball. And he has the team together, running up and down the court, doing physical strength training and just simply dribbling the ball and so on and so forth. They get a lot of backlash from others within the community saying, why do we need to do that? Why do we need to do something as simple as the very basics? And here's the lessons and here's the reasons why, and I'm going to share that with you because it's very applicable to what we're talking about with identity management. Is that identity management is so basic in the information security and IT world that sometimes we forget about the basics. And in order for us to come together as a team and effectively do identity management, we need to sometimes take it back to the basics and strip everything away and have that proverbial 101 type of discussion. Today's discussion hopefully will not necessarily be 101, but it is going to strip back all of the terms that are used in marketing today and really kind of bring it right back to what we should be doing with identity management and perhaps where we should be thinking about identity management in the future and how to address that. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll strip it back and let's just make sure that we're all on the same page here with understanding what IAM and IDM is. And the reason I put them both in here is because this is one of the things that we need to strip back. We need to strip back all of the various terms that are used for identity management. Let's just be real. Identity management is something that's been around a lot longer than IT has been around, a lot longer than the need for IT logical identity and access management. Armies and entities and organizations have been doing identity management in some way, shape, or form for literally hundreds, if not thousands of years. So what's going on in the industry right now is that we're calling this basic function by multiple different names, and we're applying different marketing labels to it and different terms to it that are confusing the scenario. Some of those terms, like zero trust, are very valuable terms, especially as NIST, the National Institutes of Science and Technologies, is now further defining zero trust. But the reality is that if you break it down to really what it is, it's not necessarily zero trust. It's a matter of identity and access management, making sure that you have a least privilege. So two of the key, very basic terms that are out there is identity and access management and identity management. And originally those two terms had different meanings. One, identity management was something that came from the old physical security world, where you were literally handing a badge or handing a physical device to somebody, and all you're doing is verifying the identity, or what we call proofing the identity before you handed that over. Identity and access management was layered on top of it after the 1994 collegiate paper that really started talking about least privilege and identifying that inside of the logical world, we're not only needing to identify people, but we also provide access rights. So both of those terms can and should be used interchangeably. But don't forget that the identity and access management, identity management goes by different terms. Some of them are marketing terms like zero trust that are evolving into legitimate defined terms. So IAM and IDM is what we'll talk about going forward in this webinar. So both of them describe, so what they both do is they both describe a concept of identifying a user, providing a user with authentication and access control. So again, stripping back just to the very basics of things is I'm providing you with an identity, and I'm providing you with an ability to use that identity with something like a password, or what we'll call an authenticator. And I'm giving you a certain boundary that you can operate in with the access control inside of that identity and access management function. So keep in mind that this is not a new concept. Again, I talked about it just a moment ago. This concept goes back hundreds of years, and in the cyber world, it goes back to a 1994 collegiate paper on least privilege. What our goal should be is not access denied, though. Unfortunately, a lot of times CISOs have the term applied to them. It's called CISO. And in access management, we need to, as CISOs, we need to really rely upon the entire three-legged stool of the confidentiality, integrity, and availability aspect. We need to rethink the fact that availability is key to a good identity and access management piece. So access denied should not be our goal, but access allowed within a boundary, within specific guidelines, within specific scenarios should be what is permitted. So after we move beyond just that basic understanding what IAM and IDM is, let's take a look at a couple of key factors that play into an effective IAM scenario. First of all, policies and procedures and guidelines are absolutely essential to an IAM program that is mature and well built. We can get those policies from multiple different sources, such as NIST. We can get them from the NIST 800-53. Of the 18 categories that are NIST 853, access control is one entire category, and access control functions are sprinkled throughout many of the other categories as well, such as the physical and environmental control set, and even some of the other systems aspects of things as well. So make sure that you have a good policy and procedures, and understand that there's a difference between policy and procedure. So your policy is your guidance. This is how we're going to operate. This is what the IAM scenario is going to look like. And your procedures are going to be how you actually function within that. And keep in mind that these are guidelines as well. And certainly you're going to be audited against those. But guidelines are scenarios where they're not, they may have some aspects that's the rule of law, if you will, within your organization. But the guidelines are boundaries that your teams can work inside of and make sure that they operate correctly and process correctly. Another key factor with IAM that a lot of companies that even have mature IAM models forget is to have assignment of account managers. Now, what does this mean is simply this, is that for every single group or role that's out there, for every single individual who has a digital identity, they need to have somebody who is an authority over that identity that says, yes, I agree that so-and-so, first of all, should have access to the system. That's the very base. Again, stripping everything away and bringing our team, back to the baseline understanding of things. Just giving access to a system should be the responsibility of someone other than the person that's asking for it, and that's the account manager. So then you move into, does that account manager agree with the additional access control rights that are part of that, such as Do you allow somebody to have read and write access, or are they only allowed to have edit or view access inside of an environment? The account managers should be ones making that decision. And if you're a CISO and you have not distributed that account manager responsibility out to other managers that are responsible for various aspects and roles within the organization, I'd like you to reconsider that type of scenario, because for a couple of different reasons. Number one, it does take some of the responsibility off of you as CISO and places it inside of the organization, a business unit, for example, where they have better knowledge of what they're trying to access and the functions that are occurring within that environment. And then also it sends some ownership. It creates a culture within the organization that security is in fact everyone's responsibility. So by having these account managers that are not part of the security team, they're a business unit manager that's responsible for validating that an individual should have system access at the very baseline, and then what their permissions are within that. It is a way of reaching out and partnering with other aspects of the organization. So assignment of account managers is an absolute key factor with IAM and IDM. Then, of course, as IT professionals, we need to take a look at the hardware and software that's available for us out there. You need to decide the horsepower that you need on your hardware, and you decide what kind of directory services that you might use. Of course, Active Directory from Microsoft is the most popular, with almost 97% of companies that are using some sort of active or some sort of directory services are using Active Directory. Keep in mind that Active Directory can power not only your enterprise itself, but also your enterprise applications, and allow for some sense of a single sign-on. I sign into my computer, it creates that token that resides on the computer and passes off to the various applications as you try and access them, and prevents the frustration that might exist when a person has to repeatedly sign on to more and more products. And with the modern world these days, we can layer on products such as Okta or other similar types of single sign-on federated identity products on top of Active Directory that will allow those credentials to also be passed off into external cloud scenarios. So make sure that you understand your hardware and software, and you're making the right decisions as to what your directory is and what kind of additional layered on approaches you might use. Now, this other thing I have identified here is identity cards. So we're moving to a scenario in the world right now where it's not just sufficient to have a username and a password. And anybody that's in the financial industry, anybody that's in high capacity security environments like the government and healthcare already knows this, but that is even floating down into manufacturing and other supply chain type of scenarios, into small businesses, is having identity cards where you can plug them into the side of the computer, that even if someone has a user ID and password, the authentication, the identity will not be validated and will not work without also this card that's in place. So another key factor is credentials and how you want to set those up. In other words, with something we would call the user ID. What is it that identifies me as an individual that's been granted access to the corporate and enterprise systems? An authenticator, I used that term earlier, is equivalent to the term password. It depends on which model you're using, but NIST likes to use the word authenticator. And then as an authenticator, we need to start, especially if we're not in healthcare, finance, or something similar to that, we really need to be looking at multi-factor or one-time password type of situations. And these are the types of situations where you may type in your user ID or your credential, and then your authenticator, your user ID and password, and then you get a text on your smartphone, or you have an application on your smartphone that allows you to push a button or respond to the text that comes in that further allows the access. And the reason that we need to be getting to these stronger authenticators in this manner is because just a password is no longer sufficient to get into systems, even with a passphrase type of situation as your password. These are all crackable. with the hyperscale and high performance computing that's out there on processors these days, they can crank through and brute force attack on authenticators that are static, like a password or a passphrase, very easily these days. Another thing that we want to start looking at, if you haven't already done so, is access control lists. And these are typical inside of a network environment where your network will not allow you to pass from one zone or one VLAN to another. But we need to start looking at access control lists as well as a key factor beyond the credential and the authenticator for boundary layer type of scenario. So a person comes into the office, they log into their computer with their credential and their authenticator, their multi-factor one-time password, and then further the system, whether it's the computer itself, whether it's roles that are applied to the Active Directory or the directory services, or even the network access control list, those access control lists will define your boundary and keep you within those spaces. So these are some key factors to consider as you develop and move forward with an IAM and IDM program. All right. One of the things you'll always hear from me if we're on any type of call, if we're on any type of discussion, webinar like this, is I always lean towards the NIST models, because there are so many well-tested and efficient methodologies out there that are put forward by NIST. And one of the things I want to talk about is this identity life cycle. And this graphic here has been presented and pulled from NIST 800-63 Revision A. So I'm not reinventing the wheel here. I'm showing you where you can go and find literally a book of additional information on this effort. But let's just kind of walk through this life cycle that exists for identity management. First of all, you have an applicant. Let's say you have an applicant for your job, or maybe you already have someone who is in your organization who is changing roles, or perhaps maybe someone's presenting to you that they are applying or that they have some new credential or new access that they need on a system. So that is your applicant. They're applying for additional or new security, new access control to your system. What we're going to do, first of all, is we're going to take a look at their core attributes and make sure that we've collected everything that's necessary for us to identify or proof that individual and validate who they are. Because one of the things that's going on in the world right now is a significant amount of spoofing of identities. And if we can't prove who that applicant is or who the individual is that we're giving the credentials to, then we're going to have a significant problem with the later results of the hacking or the data breaches that occur. So once you've collected all the evidence that's necessary, then you can move forward with uniquely identifying and distinguishing that individual throughout your population. What this basically means is that no single person within your organization should have the same identity as another. Now, this is where some of those directory services come in to help you. Is that at the very basic, at their core, is they will not allow for the credential to be replicated or identical to another individual. So as part of this process, and your development process, your IAM and IDM development process, as you look at architecting this, is you need to have a solution that will in fact uniquely identify people. And although there's the technical control in place by the directory, you need to have some sort of identifying way of putting in a user credential. Sometimes they're random numbers that are put together. Sometimes they're first initial, middle initial, last name, or some combination of that type of thing that will uniquely identify the individual. Now, I typically lean towards more of the common or friendly type of scenarios, like using first initial, last name, or first initial, middle initial, and last name. Is much more effective. And then if there's duplicate scenarios like a J.W. Smith, for example, you may want to put a 1 on the end of that, or another identifier, for example, what department they're in or what year they came into your organization. So you could have J.W. Smith .21 or JW Smith.22 if they came in 2022 sort of thing. So once you've identified the individual uniquely, you can move to the validation process. And this is where you take their government issued ID card and you actually, sit there in front of them and make sure that the individual is who they say they are. Think about it this way. I think all of us have probably been on a flight sometime in the past couple of years or sometime since 9/11. And when you approach the TSA desk, you have to present your ticket for the flight, but you also have to present some sort of card. And what they're doing right there is they're validating that evidence by your face, by the ticket, and by the ID card you have. And of course, we're moving to real ID scenarios where that evidence has been further validated and controlled elsewhere. So once we've done that validation, we need to then move into the verification, not just the validation, but the verification process, where we're now testing that evidence to make sure that it truly is the individual. And here's where you start linking the electronic scenario in with the real life, as they put it, the real life existence here, where you may have a smartphone or something where it's where it will tie to that individual. So and then that's at that point, once you've moved through these processes, they become a subscriber. If you're inside of an enterprise type of environment, it can be boiled down. Again, bringing it down to the very simple stuff is that you have the options to create, modify, or disable user IDs. That's really the life cycle inside of an enterprise scenario. When you're creating these user IDs, you want to look at that life cycle of validating a person's information. And perhaps, it's very typical for us as IT professionals, as CISOs, for our teams to be validating when the credential is handed out. But how many of us go back and revalidate the credentials at a later time, making sure that the individual is still who they say they are? And especially with a lot of changes going on in our culture and our society today, these are very important. Make sure somebody's not spoofing the individual or having taken on the identity of another individual. All right, so you can, in order for you to create this life cycle, one of the areas that you can go take a look at that will help guide you through this is NIST 800-53, currently in revision 4 or revision 5, has an entire section on access control that will allow you to identify what key factors are necessary for creating the policies and the best practices for an identity lifecycle. Further to that, you could move over to the 800-63 a set of documents, and there's a standard 863 revision 3 that's available that is all about identity management and access management. But then there are sub items, 863A, B, and C, that go deeper on certain subjects for you to follow. So as part of your identity lifecycle, you need to, first of all, have that policy that we discussed earlier. You need to document and follow your processes. And the reason for this is if you deviate from the policies or the processes, you're going to find yourself with a hodgepodge of users out there who may or may not be validated. And then further, if you're in an environment that requires or does have auditing, like an SSAE 18 or a PCI type of scenario, or even healthcare environment, they're going to want to come back to you and understand your processes and make sure that you follow those processes. So make sure that you document and follow your processes. Once you move through that validating and the unique identifier scenarios that we just talked about on the life cycle prior, then that's when the person has their credentials. That's when they've been given basic access. Then you need to start looking at rights assignments. And this is where the access control lists come into place. This is where the group and role assignments come into place depending on the type of system that exists out there. And you want to be very careful. This is where you're going to go back, and this is where one slide starts building upon another, is you're going to want to go back and work with your account managers to make sure that the access rights for the groups and the roles that you're giving an individual are in fact what they need for the system that they're accessing. So for example, if you have a financial system it should not be the CISO that's deciding necessarily at the baseline what kind of roles and groups an individual user should be assigned to. Now, it may be that the CISO is the one, or his or her team is the one that's applying the controls and managing those types of things, but the actual decisions from separation of duties perspective, as well as from the fact that the financial team as the subject matter experts, they would be better, the account manager would be better to go and have that discussion with. So your account manager can help you with the rights assignments and determining whether somebody needs to have edit rights or view rights or ability to change and so on and so forth. Working with your accounts manager for that rights assignment is absolutely important. So once all those things are done, your identity lifecycle demands that you deliver the identity and the authenticator to the individual that you're trying to grant the access to. And we've talked about the proofing and the secure delivery of authenticators to some degree. But one of the things you have to be careful of is not just handing out a password to a manager and saying, hey, give this to your new employee as they come on board. We need to find secure ways of delivering these authenticators, and especially the authenticators, to the new person, to the new individual. You're not going to have, in the real ID scenario, you're not going to have a situation where your real ID is handed to a spouse or a child and the government says, yeah, just go give it to you. They're going to have somebody show up at your house and say, whoever answers the door is going to get this real ID card. There's actually going to be signatures, there's going to be validations, and so on and so forth that exist. So securely deliver your authenticators to the persons in which you're trying to deliver. So as part of your architecture and the whole discussion of IAM, you need to understand and identify what kind of access types you're going to assign an individual. And in this world, because of the way that we different compliance regulations and such identify people such as subcontractors and so on and so forth, we can't just throw everybody into the same directory bucket anymore and provide the same access rights to those individuals as we would anyone else within the organization. So it's my recommendation that you look at having probably 4 different types of access types. And to be quite honest with you, these are the 4 access types that are coming outside or from out in the NIST 853 documents. First of all, you can have an employee or an internal user. This type of person is actually employed with your organization. They are someone who would get a W-2 from at the end of the year for their tax purposes. These are people that you have some sort of control and some sort of control of with your HR department, so on and so forth. Then you need to take a look at identifying all your contractors or subcontractors. These are individuals that work for other companies, that perhaps independently, and you want to have them segmented off differently, because you may have a situation, and I worked for a company once that did actually have this situation where your employee, although you might be in the same department, you may even be sitting right next to a contractor, an employee and a contractor sitting next to one another. The contractor was not allowed to do certain functions or see certain types of documents. So you need to be able to granularly pull those contractors out of certain groups, roles, and rights. And so by architecting this properly from the beginning, it will help you get to that scenario. Then with the applications that are out there and with the installation of software and so on and so forth, it's absolutely essential to have a shared or group user accounts as well. Now, this is typically a type of thing that auditors or otherwise people are constantly shy about, or they're asking about in the hopes that you don't have shared group user accounts. But anybody would say you don't have those types of accounts would be probably telling you a few fibs, because every type of software that's installed, whether it's a cloud-based software or if it's an on-prem type software, in order for it to interact with something as simple as the directory services, is going to have some sort of token or some sort of login function that will allow it to do so. Now, these shared group user accounts should be highly restricted. They should be very carefully taken care of and limited to only those that are necessary. So you're going to have them in your environment. these are probably going to be some of the most highly sought after and potentially the highest risk type of accounts that are out there. So keep a good eye on that, and we'll talk about continuous monitoring in just a moment. The other type of account that people mess up on quite frequently is the privileged user account. And the reason that they mess up on this is because it's typically the IT people who need the privileged user accounts, and it's typically the IT people who are also the ones that define the policies and procedures and implement accounts like contractor user and employee user. So they're typically just not going to create additional hurdles for themselves to get over. But as a CISO, as a leader within your organization, you need to demand that your employee and contractor users use a completely separate account when they're logging into systems with privileged access. Now, what is privileged access? Privileged access is an administrative account into a server, administrative account into an application. And if you're using a directory service like Okta or like Microsoft Active Directory or similar types of functions, these all have privileged users that really have keys to the kingdom, that once you have access to that scenario, you're going to have pretty much access to everything, like domain users and enterprise users and so on and so forth. So these accounts should be a completely separate account from your employee and user contractor type of individual. And you should insist that the employee user or the contractor user is what the individuals who have privileged user accounts utilize on a day-to-day basis for their routine functions, such as logging into their workstations and email and browsing the internet or other applications. And they only use their privileged user account when they're specifically doing an administrative function inside of an application or directory or server. And then they immediately log out and get out. So I said the shared group user accounts are accounts that are attacked on a frequent basis. They do typically allow for the crown jewels, but it's interesting that sometimes privileged user accounts are shared group and user accounts. And this is something you need to be careful of and not do. One of the problems that we saw with the SolarWinds attack of a year ago was that a shared group user account also had privileged user access, which allowed for the attackers to gain access to anything on an impacted network. So make sure that you use the privileged user correctly, that you have clear policies and procedures around that in that identity and access management function, and logging so you know what's going on. All right, some of the future things you need to consider with IAM, and I'm not going to go over every single one of these, but depending on the market that your vertical that you're in, you're going to be seeing some changes come down. First of all, the linkage of digital and physical identities is already here and already coming. This is where what you do online will also allow you to have access to physical locations. So, getting from one place to another inside of a building and so on and so forth is going to be the same identity, where typically it has been a completely different identity inside of most scenarios. Even inside of the U.S. federal government, you would have one card for accessing building, another card for being able to access the logical scenarios. You're going to see the melding of these two coming together over the next couple of years. And those types of things are going to be addressed, and they are currently addressed through what's called the PIV or CAC or a similar type of card that looks like a driver's license type thing with a credit card type chip that's inside of it that allows you to walk up to readers physically or plug them into your computer, and it will follow you wherever you go. So these are the linkage scenarios. The PIV CAC cards are actually the linkage between the two. Biometrics is something that was attempted a couple of years ago. We probably all remember a number of years ago where the computers that were coming from Dell and HP and otherwise, they all had little fingerprint readers on them, and our smartphones had some sort of biometric scenario. And those are all what I call false starts. But in reality, biometrics is going to be significant factor in logical system access where it is currently not. Biometrics is a long time scenario inside of the physical environment. And again, this is where the linkage of digital and physical identities are going to occur. If you want to go and take a look at where we're headed with this, there's a number of startup companies out there, and some of them are actually fairly mature right now, who are blending the biometrics and the physical and logical access identities that are out there. One of the companies you can go take a look at out of Toronto, Canada, is called BioConnect. They have some very forward-thinking and some very interesting products that are already on the market and are being used day in and day out in lots of other places. Another scenario that we're going to have to look at with future IAM considerations are privacy and other types of regulations. Right now, governments are regulating the environments significantly throughout the entire world, specifically coming out of Europe and certain states within the United States. So these regulations are things that we're going to have to take a look at, and especially privacy with those that are and how they intersect with our physical and logical identities. And then another thing that you should be looking at now, but is going to be a considerable consideration in the future, is how often and how frequently we're reviewing reports and disabling unused accounts. Right now, a lot of our applications that are out there on the internet, they just leave the identity out there forever. If you've gone to a college or university anytime in the last 10 years, you probably still have an email and still have access to that because there's marketing and there's, hey, come back and do more school and so on and so forth. So we're going to really have to be taking a look at how these stale accounts are potentially sitting out there and causing vulnerabilities within our organizations. So what are some of the gotchas you want to watch out for with IAM? First of all, small incidents can lead to big problems. So don't underestimate a small incident that's out there. So for example, if a person's password, if they come in and say, hey, my kid got access to my computer, with a lot of us working at home right now, don't just blow that off. Immediately respond to that as if it were a larger incident, and go through the process of evaluating, taking a look at log files and things like that to make sure that there is nothing nefarious that's going on with that account. Because a lot of times hackers or attackers will gain access to these credentials and they'll sit on them for a couple of months, and then they'll come back and use them later. So make sure that you pay attention to those small incidents. And especially with ransomware right now, ransomware is taking advantage of a lot of these types of small incident scenarios and really blowing them up into larger ones. Be careful that you're not granting more access than what is needed. Follow the least privilege model. That's the model where it says, hey, I can only access the things that I really need. A lot of times companies will try and do that, but then over time it leads to too much access. Somebody changes roles. They may be working on a particular project and then move on to a different project, and the access from the old project has never been removed. And so all of a sudden you find out that somebody has admin access on a system that they were originally on a project for to stand it up and deploy it. And they no longer need admin access, but they've had access, that admin access for years because it's never been checked. So make sure that you're running reports and you're identifying the access that's out there and only granting what's needed. Another gotcha that we have to look out for is these, what I call the ancillary systems. We talked about directory services earlier, and these directory services are designed to be able to say, hey, we're giving access to multiple systems. They're tied into that. They're talking, they're passing tokens back and forth between one another. But these ancillary systems are the ones that don't tie to your Active Directory or your LDAP, your directory services. And so they have installed individual user IDs or individual credentials and authenticators. And those are the types of systems where the group policies are not applied evenly across those systems. Those are the types of systems where you can find that too much access has been granted, where stale accounts, terminated accounts, people who have terminated your organization still have accounts in these types of systems. So watch out for those, because that is where the bad guys are going to get you. The bad guys are going to be out there looking for these types of scenarios in order to attack you. And then the lack of continuous monitoring, because identity management is such a routine thing. A lot of companies, especially those that are not in the financial industry, really have a lack of this continuous monitoring. They have a lack of oversight of what's on their systems and running reports to identify how, when the last time somebody was logged in, and has it been greater than 30 days or 90 days? And do we need to look at disabling the account? And oh, wait a minute, I've got a list of terminated employees, and this particular employee still has access to the systems. Why is that? And trying to link those two together. So those are some gotchas that you have to work with that. So let's turn our attention to this continuous monitoring best practices types of scenarios. That's what I want to leave you with today. First of all, if you don't have an access control review process, you need to have one. Depending on your vertical, you can have it from anywhere from an annual process all the way down to monthly processes. And my recommendation in our world today is that you have some sort of function that's done on a monthly basis. And you should define what you're going to review in your access control review. At a very basic scenario, I would recommend that you gather a list from some place like human resources, what I call an authoritative source, of all the persons who are legitimately should have access within your system. Okay, so for example, I go to our HR department and I have them run a list of names with their email addresses and their user IDs out of our HR system on a monthly basis. And I marry that up with what's inside of my directory system to make sure that I'm not having people who are not on that authoritative active list still inside of my directory. I do the same thing with the terminated persons list. I get a list from my HR department of every person that was terminated in the last 30 days, and I go and validate on a monthly basis that that person's access has been terminated inside of my directory. And honestly, all these things is a second check, because your standard life cycle process should have that function that when a person is terminated, your teams are notified and the person is disabled and removed from the system. So this here continuous monitoring is simply validating what you should already have done and what you should already know. It's that second check, if you will. So comparing those lists and understanding what you have inside of your system is the very basic of what you should be doing. Another function within, if you want to take it a step up, is doing this validation of the list is great, but have a primary and a secondary reviewer, have two sets of eyes on it. And going back again, building on slide, one of the things I do within our organizations, I have my security compliance folks do the primary review. So they get the list of the authoritative source of the active person's list. They get the terminated list. They validate that all the people that have access are real. Of course, we do that through automation, but we validate that the automation is working. And then we take that list and we manually go to the account managers as secondary reviewers. And we say, okay, all of these people are people who report to you in your department. Should they still have access within the systems? And by the way, while you're looking at that, they also have these groups or these access control lists that are in place. Are these valid as well? And we'll do that on a quarterly basis. So we're not bugging everybody on a monthly basis. We're doing the secondary reviewer piece on a quarterly basis. Again, it's just a second set of eyes on the system to make sure that that we're not having anything that we missed. Just by human nature, even with automated systems, we're going to make mistakes, and this allows us to catch those mistakes early on and correct them. Finally, do not mistake your primary and secondary reviewers for a third-party review as well. You should have auditors come in on an annual basis that will review the work that you've done and take a sampling of the work that you've done and validate for themselves that in fact it's done, that continuous monitoring has been done. So, what our auditors do is they come in, we give them a list of all the active people, we give them a list of all the terminated people, we give them a list of all the people that are in the systems, and they go through that and make sure that all of our terminated people are actually terminated, that all of our active people, or all the people that are on our directory list are actually active persons as per our HR department. So having that next layer, and that only occurs on an annual basis, but having that next layer, that third-party audit is essential. So another piece of the continuous monitoring and best practices is generate a report that reviews the users that have not logged in for a specific period of time. In our case, we say anybody that hasn't logged into our systems in 30 days is somebody that we want to question, because that person may still be employed with the organization, so they would show up on the HR authoritative source of active persons. They would not show up on a terminated list, so on and so forth. So this report says, hey, you haven't logged in for 30 days, and I can take that back to HR and say, is there a health issue here where this person's been on medical leave, paternity leave, maternity leave? Are they a military person that's deployed right now? And in those cases, we would take that and we would then disable the individual until they came back from whatever kind of leave that they were getting on. So you can see how these continuous monitoring functions layered up on top of your normal life cycle processes add an additional layer of control, an additional layer of propriety to what we do within IAM. All right, so wrapping it up with this, for sure, where do we go to learn more? I recommend that you go to NIST. That's inside U.S. environment. NIST is a highly credible source. IAM is the only function that I'm aware of where they have an entire page that's set up just for the subject matter. The other stuff they have documents and whatnot that they put together, and they're on pages that allow you to download them. But IAM and IDM actually have a page where they have newsroom, blogs, and other resources that are available to you. So that's here at this nist.gov/ITIL/applied cybersecurity /TIG/newsroom. The primary documents you need to look at or source documents for guidelines for IAM is NIST 800-63-3, and there are a number of sub-documents under there. There's a document that's 63A that teaches you how to identify and prove an individual, how to enroll them. 63B talks about the life cycle that we just talked about quite extensively here, and 63C gets into some more higher end type stuff where we do federated type of situations. In other words, where we're doing our directory being out there in the world so we can log into web applications and so on and so forth. So that's what we got, going back to the basics there with IAM. Here's how you can get a hold of me if you want to further, have further discussions on this. The telephone number, you can reach out to our salespeople if you want to talk about how you might put in some directory controls and things like that inside of a cloud environment here at DataBank. Christian, I'd like to turn it back over to you. If there's any questions that I can answer out there, I'd be happy to do so.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. All right. So we will go into the Q&A session. You can place your questions in the chat below. If you have any questions, go ahead and send them my way. All right, we have one in the chat. It says, when you need to disable an account because someone is on PTO or leave, how should you go about re-enabling the account?
Oh, great question. So I just talked about how to disable the what you might look for to disable it. Here's how I handle that. I would, always look towards an authoritative source. So if somebody's on military leave, medical leave, paternity, maternity leave type thing, I would be looking not for their manager to come back to me and say, hey, this person's back, but I would look for HR to come back and say, this person's back now inside the organization. The reason I look towards HR is not just the fact that they're human resources, but typically HR would initiate the check, the payment process for their work being done, their wages, reinitiate any of their benefits that may have been suspended, things like that. So looking towards HR as the authoritative source would ensure that you are covered on re-enabling them inside of your environment.
Great, thank you. I have another one that says, how does biometrics validation tie to digital and physical access? I am familiar with biometrics for physical access.
Okay, great. So, you're familiar with the physical access with biometrics. You might put a handprint or hand palm reader down, or perhaps even an iris scanner type of situation. With that type of scenario with logical access, you would need to have some sort of a reader that's attached to your computer, or perhaps you've got a biometric identity, and this is where it could be a whole separate webinar. And we could possibly do a webinar like this with our friends over at BioConnect up in Canada. But you can retain your biometric information, for example, on a smartphone, where there's a tokenized validation that goes back and forth between the provider and yourself as the releaser of that. So basically what would happen in this type of scenario is that your biometric, whatever it is, your iris, your eyes, your fingerprint, whatever, would be saved onto a device, and then you would validate the use of that through another device. So you could, for example, have the biometrics saved within a system on premise at DataBank that would allow you to access physical security. And then once you log in with into your directory, it fires off to the biometric system, which initiates a call out to a specified device that allows you to authenticate with that. Again, it does get very complicated, but it is an option that we can look at putting in place. And our friends over at BioConnect are experts in that type of scenario.
Great. Next question says, what tool or tools do you use to report on account lockouts or other status?
Yes, so there's a whole bunch of different tools and capabilities for that. You can go everything from writing your own scripts. Active Directory, for example, is very open as far as writing scripts through PowerShell. There's a lot of scripts that are out there available on the internet for you to download. If you don't know how to write PowerShell scripts, there's a lot of consultants that would easily write PowerShell scripts. There's also a number of different tools you can buy, what we call COTS, commercial off the shelf. One of my favorites that I've used for years is called Manage Engine, that allows you to do all sorts of reporting, including the identification of when the last login occurs. So what it does is it searches through all of the logs within Active Directory, identifies when the last logon occurred, and spits out a report. You can set it up so it will do it on a timed basis, recurring timed basis type of thing. You can get a report on a daily basis or monthly, weekly, however you want to approach that.
Awesome. Next question says, Mark, do you see CAC PIV use in commercial? I am familiar with CAC PIV usage in government.
Yeah, so PIV-CAC cards, if you're not familiar with them, could pull one out of the wallet here, but they're little ID cards. I think I talked about them a moment ago. They kind of look like your driver's license, but embedded inside of it is that chip, or a chip like what you typically have embedded inside of a credit card. And it has all sorts of identity information on there. The U.S. federal government uses those extensively to log in. You have to insert them into your computer in order to log in. You use them to insert them into physical, in some cases, physical access, and so on and so forth. Do I see that moving into the commercial environment? At this point, I have not seen it move into the commercial environment, even to the point where we have federal contractors who are customers of DataBank that have applications there. There's not a requirement from the federal government that PIV-CAC card necessarily is also required on those external applications. And being that the cards can be lost and the cards are very expensive, I don't see it going that direction. It's not unheard of that it would, but I don't see it going that direction. I see us moving more towards something that's on our smartphones, something that, like one-time password push type of scenarios where it's a multi-factor authentication situation. It pushes to a validated smartphone. The hurdle we have to get over there that the PIV-CAC cards actually have down pretty well pat is the fact that the the smartphones can be spoofed, whereas the PIV-CAT cards, it's very difficult to do that. So we need to get to some sort of a blockchain or other digital identity type of scenario that is very clearly locked down to an individual smartphone or an individual itself. But again, that could be a whole hour-long discussion, if you will, on blockchain and different types of functions with and use with the use with access control.
Okay, thank you. Next question says, we have vendors that require access for support purposes from time to time. Is it a best practice to leave these accounts always active or disable them while not in use?
Yeah, that's a great question, because with so many vendors that are supporting both on-prem and cloud-based scenarios, you know, and a lot of outsourcing, if you will. You know, companies will come in and they'll buy a product and they'll expect that vendor to fully support it because they don't have the IT people and security people on staff that would support it. So that is a great question. What should you do with their credentials? And my answer, as strictly as a CISO, regardless of where I'm at, is that those credentials are in a disabled state. And depending on what they access, you may even strip them out of all of their access control rules, groups, and rules when they are not used, and you have a process in place for re-enabling that account as part of any incident response, any sort of support response type of scenario. And again, if that account is a scenario where it might be a privileged account, re-adding the types of privileges that are necessary prior to the individual accessing it. Now, some of you may be hearing that and saying, well, that's cumbersome and that could cause delay in support. You're absolutely correct. But personally, I would, as a CISO, I would rather have a little bit of delay in support. And when I say delay, we're talking no more than 15 minutes in that support versus somebody having those credentials wide open and they be hacked and attacked, and somebody going into the backside of it days on days without me knowing about it. So I'd rather go towards the protective side of that and disable the account.
Next question says, how do you think about monitoring the privileged access users as they can be inside threat actors?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're not monitoring them, even more so than you would your employee users, then you're probably opening yourself up to threats. So with privileged users, you should be logging every action that they do, not just a positive action, but also negative actions. You know, so what I mean by that is not just when they add something to a system, but also when they remove something from a system. You should be logging their access to it, every action they take, everything they do, and putting that off into an alternative system automatically, a log SIEM system. And you should have alerts running on those logs that will identify for you when a privileged access account's been used. And if you have the budget to do it, that log analysis tool should also be identifying any anomalies that might exist with the use of that. So for example, is the privileged user account being logged in when the tied to employee user account is not logged in anywhere? So for example, you know, if the person's not logged into their computer with their employee account, and they're using the privileged account, that could be an alert that pops up. Are they using it outside of normal parameters from a time zone perspective? Are they, does the privileged user account normally used for, specific item A, B, and C, and today it's being used for E, F, and G? Why is that the case? And popping alerts to the right people. Keep in mind that your alerts should never pop to the person who the privileged account is used for. Have some sort of separation of duties in there to make sure that the privileged user knows that they're being watched. This is a great opportunity to tell your folks that yes, Big Brother is watching on this one, and here's why, and build that into your culture from a positive perspective, rather than them finding out later on through negative aspects that they're being watched.
Great. Next question. Looks like we have time for one more. What are some best practices for software-based accounts?
Software-based accounts. So that goes back to our group and shared account use. First of all, you should only allow that group shared account when you have to. Second of all, their user rights should be very specific. And typically what I do is I make the vendor of the software tell me what rights they expect in order for their software to run properly. And then not only that, they need to explain why and what each role, what each access control list function is doing, so that I know what to expect out of the use of that account. So that is the group shared accounts are required in these day and age, but you need to control them and more importantly, understand exactly what they do.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. That will conclude today's webinar. So you can contact Mark at his contact information right here on the screen. You can follow DataBank on LinkedIn for more upcoming webinars and in-person events. You can also find upcoming events on our website, databank.com, under the events link. Please feel free to reach out with any questions you might have, and thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next time.